10 years ago, a widowed CEO turned Christmas into a season of silence and solitude after losing his pregnant wife. But everything changes with the arrival of an employee's young daughter. With her bright and spontaneous presence, the child reopens doors locked by grief and rekindles forgotten memories. A chance encounter becomes the new beginning of a family he never imagined he could have. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's continue. New York City was waking up to a bustling Christmas Eve, its streets packed with people carrying colorful shopping bags, their anxious faces rushing from one place to another in search of last-minute gifts. Storefronts glittered with lights that blinked in a steady rhythm, and the scent of gingerbread and cinnamon wafted from bakeries on every corner. It was the kind of frenetic energy that made anyone feel part of something bigger, a collective celebration that filled the air with anticipation and joy. But for Robert Anderson, all of it was just distant noise, something happening on the other side of the window of his mansion in Scarsdale, far enough not to bother him, yet too close to be ignored. Robert was 42, with dark hair starting to grey at the temples, broad shoulders that carried an invisible weight, and brown eyes that had long since lost their sparkle. He owned a successful real estate development firm, inherited from his father, and expanded with his own sweat and determination. Business was good, contracts were renewed, money flowed in. But none of it mattered when he came home at the end of the day to find only silence. 7 years, 7 Christmases alone. 7 times he had set a table for one, lit a single candle, and toasted the emptiness with a glass of wine he barely touched. 7 years since Caroline was gone, taking with her not only her presence, but also the baby they had been so eagerly expecting. An unexpected complication during the pregnancy, the doctors had said. A condition that progressed too quickly, they explained in cold, technical voices. Robert heard the words, but couldn't process them. All that remained was a gaping hole where there had once been plans, dreams, a future. He never allowed anyone to speak of it. He didn't receive visitors, accept invitations, or build new friendships. His sister, Patricia, had tried for years to get him out of the house, to introduce him to women, to get him back into a social life. He always refused politely but firmly. Grief had become his routine, his strange and painful comfort zone. December was just another month to get through, like a narrow, dangerous bridge over a chasm. That Christmas Eve morning, Robert woke up earlier than usual. The sun hadn't fully risen when he descended the mansion's marble staircase, walked through the spacious living room decorated with classic furniture and old paintings, and entered the kitchen. He made a strong black coffee and sat at the enormous table that could seat 12, but had served only him for years. He drank in silence, watching through the window as the well-manicured garden was tended by a landscaper who came once a week and never spoke beyond what was strictly necessary. The day passed without incident. Robert worked for a few hours in his home office, answered emails, signed documents digitally, and spoke on the phone with 2 partners about a project starting in January. It was all mechanical, automatic, emotionless. At noon, he ate a simple meal he had prepared the night before alone. In the afternoon, he tried to read a book, but the words made no sense. His mind wandered, always returning to the same places. It was late in the afternoon, as the sky began to turn shades of orange, that the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the empty house, shattering the silence so abruptly that Robert flinched. He wasn't expecting anyone. He never expected anyone. For a moment he considered ignoring it, but the bell rang again insistently. Robert walked to the front door and opened it with some reluctance. On the other side, he found a young woman appearing to be in her early 30s, with brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and a plain white blouse. Beside her, a little girl of about 7 held her hand, her curious, bright eyes scanning the mansion's facade with wonder. The woman introduced herself, Maria Sanchez, from the residential cleaning service he had hired a few weeks ago for a deep clean before the end of the year. She was there to confirm the appointment for the next morning. There had been a mix-up in the schedule, she explained, in a polite but slightly nervous voice, and she preferred to come in person to make sure everything was set. Robert confirmed a bit awkwardly. Yes, she could come the next day. The agreed-upon time was fine, no problem. He was about to close the door when the little girl beside Maria stepped forward, looking up at him with disarming frankness. "Do you live in this huge house all by yourself, mister?" the child asked, unfiltered, with the kind of brutal honesty only children possess. Maria immediately turned red, gently pulling her daughter's hand. "Julia, don't be so nosy. For heaven's sake," she scolded, but the girl kept looking at Robert, waiting for an answer. Robert was taken aback. He wasn't used to interacting with children, much less answering such direct questions. "Yes," he finally said, his voice emerging hoarser than he intended. "I live alone." Julia frowned thoughtfully. It must be really sad to live alone in such a big house. It looks like one of those empty castles in fairy tales. Maria tried to intervene again, clearly embarrassed, but Robert raised a hand in a gesture that it was okay. There was something about that childish observation that hit him in an unexpected way, as if someone had finally put into words something he had felt for years, but never admitted out loud. "Sometimes it is a little lonely," he admitted, and as he spoke, he felt a strange lump in his throat. The girl didn't seem satisfied with the answer. She exchanged a quick glance with her mother and then, with all the spontaneity in the world, extended an invitation that sounded utterly improbable. "Then come spend Christmas with us. We live in a small apartment, but my mom's making roast chicken, mashed potatoes, stuffing, and even a green bean casserole. It'll be fun." Maria's eyes widened in complete embarrassment. "Julia, honey, Mr. Anderson surely has other plans. You don't need to bother with us," she said quickly, trying to retract the invitation. "I'm so sorry, she's very spontaneous." Robert stood there looking at this child who barely knew him, but was inviting him to her home with such naturalness. It had been years since anyone had invited him to anything, and when they did, it was always with a tone of social obligation, of disguised pity. But Julia didn't pity him, she just thought he was lonely, and that wasn't right. "I really appreciate it," Robert said kindly, "but I'm going to stay here. I have some commitments." It was a lie, of course. His only commitment was to his solitude, but he couldn't say that to a child. Julia looked disappointed, but accepted with a nod. Maria apologized once more, confirmed the time for the next day, and said goodbye, leading her daughter away by the hand. Robert closed the door and stood in the foyer for a long time, the invitation still echoing in his mind. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, stuffing, a simple table, full of people, full of life, the complete opposite of what he had. That night Robert set the usual table, a single candle, a single glass, a plate he barely touched, but for the first time in years, as he toasted the emptiness, he felt something different. It wasn't exactly sadness, nor was it hope. It was a tiny crack in the armor he had built around his heart, so small it was almost unnoticeable. Almost. The next morning, as Christmas Eve finally gave way to Christmas Day, the doorbell rang promptly at 8 o'clock. Robert, who had been awake for some time, opened the door to find Maria with an apologetic expression. Beside her once again was Julia. "Sorry to bring her again," Maria explained as she entered with her cleaning supplies. "The neighbor who was going to watch her had a last-minute emergency, and I couldn't leave her home alone on Christmas. I promise she won't be a bother. I'll have her watch cartoons in the living room while I work." Robert nodded, indicating it was no problem. He usually locked himself in his second-floor office while the house was being cleaned, avoiding any interaction. But that morning, something was different. As he walked up the stairs, he heard Julia's excited voice commenting on the Christmas tree in the living room, which was still undecorated. "What a sad tree," she said aloud, not realizing Robert was still within earshot. "It looks like it's waiting for someone to make it pretty." Robert stopped halfway up the stairs. He looked back and saw Julia observing the tree with that childlike seriousness, her head tilted to one side. Maria was trying to get her daughter to sit on the sofa, but the girl was fascinated by the incomplete decoration. It was then that Robert did something he hadn't done in a very long time. He came back down the stairs, entered the living room, and stood beside Julia. "You think it's sad?" he asked, surprised by his own voice. The girl looked up at him and nodded with conviction. Christmas trees need ornaments, colourful balls, a star on top, otherwise they're just plain. Robert looked at the tree. He put it up every year out of habit, but never decorated it. It seemed pointless to do it alone. But now, with Julia there looking at him expectantly, something inside him gave way. "Do you want to help me make it pretty?" he asked. And as he posed the question, he felt as if he were opening a door he had locked 7 years ago. Julia's eyes lit up. Maria, watching from a distance, hesitated. "Mr. Anderson, we don't need to be a bother," she began, but Robert raised his hand. "It's no bother," he said, and this time he was telling the truth. "I have the decorations stored in the attic. I'll go get them." Half an hour later, the living room was filled with open boxes, ornaments scattered on the floor, and Julia organizing everything with the seriousness of someone on an important mission. Robert, sitting on the rug beside her, picked up each Christmas ball, each silver ribbon, each paper star, and handed it to the girl, who carefully hung everything on the tree's branches. "This one is the prettiest," Julia said, holding up a red ball with gold details. "It goes in the most special place." "And where is the most special place?" Robert asked. Julia thought for a moment, her eyes scanning the entire tree. "Right in the middle, where everyone sees it when they walk into dew. The room. Because pretty things need to be where people can see them." Robert felt something tighten in his chest. He took the ball from Julia's hands and hung it exactly where she had indicated. It was perfect. Maria watched everything as she dusted a bookshelf in the background. There was something deeply touching about the scene, something she couldn't quite name. This man, clearly marked by some profound pain, was smiling. It was a small, restrained smile, but it was real. And her daughter, with all the innocence in the world, was doing something no one else had managed to do. She was making him participate in life again. When the tree was finally finished, Julia took a step back, observing the result with pride. "There," she declared, "now it's happy." Robert looked at the tree and, for the first time in 7 years, didn't just see a decorative object fulfilling a social protocol. He saw something that had been built with care, with attention, with presence. He saw life. "Thank you, Julia," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. "You're right, now it's happy." The girl smiled, satisfied, and went back to playing with the leftover ornaments. Robert remained there, sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by boxes and ribbons, and realized that something inside him had shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A larger crack in that armor. A light seeping through a fissure that had once been completely sealed. Maria finished her cleaning a few hours later. As she left, leading Julia by the hand, the girl waved enthusiastically at Robert. "Merry Christmas, mister from the big house," she shouted before getting into her mother's car. "Merry Christmas, Julia," Robert replied, and this time he didn't feel the usual weight that always accompanied those words. That night, alone again, Robert looked at the illuminated tree. The lights blinked in a steady rhythm, the ornaments reflected the soft glow, and the red ball with gold details occupied the most special place, right in the middle, where everyone could see it. He thought of the girl, of the impromptu invitation to Christmas at her simple home, of the disarming spontaneity with which she had entered his life. And for the first time in 7 years, Robert didn't toast to the emptiness. He toasted to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was still something beyond grief, something beyond the pain, something worth feeling, even if it meant risking getting hurt again. The house was still too big for one person. The silence still dominated the rooms. But that night, as the tree lights twinkled softly in the living room, Robert felt that something had begun to change, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of it. The days following Christmas brought a strange quiet to Robert's mansion. The tree remained lit in the living room, its ornaments shining like small testaments that something different had happened there. But the house had returned to its usual silence, and Robert found himself repeatedly looking at the decoration, remembering Julia's small hands hanging each ball, each ribbon, with such care and joy. He tried to resume his usual routine: work, emails, video conferences, documents to sign, but there was a restlessness that wouldn't leave him in peace, as if something inside him had been awakened and now refused to go back to sleep. At night, when he sat alone at the dinner table, he thought about the invitation he had declined, the simple table with roast chicken and stuffing, the possibility of not being alone. On the morning of December 27th, Robert did something impulsive. He picked up the phone and called the cleaning service, requesting that Maria return for some extra work. There were closets that needed organizing, he explained to the receptionist. Windows that needed a deeper clean. They were excuses, and he knew it. But he couldn't admit the real reason. He wanted to see Julia again. Maria arrived the next day, promptly at 9 in the morning. She brought her daughter again with the same apologetic expression as before. "Daycare is closed until the new year," she explained as she arranged her supplies in the laundry room. "I hope it's not a problem." Robert waved it off, saying it was no problem at all. Julia entered the house as if she already knew every corner, greeting him with a wide, spontaneous smile. "Good morning, mister from the big house. How's our tree?" "It's beautiful," Robert replied, feeling strangely comfortable with her presence. "Thanks to you." The girl ran to the living room to check if everything was still in place. Robert followed her, watching as she examined each ornament with attention, as if revisiting a piece of art she had created herself. When Julia turned to him, she had a curious expression on her face. "Why didn't you put any presents under the tree?" she asked, pointing to the empty space around the base. "Christmas trees always have presents under them." Robert hesitated. He didn't know how to explain to a child that he hadn't exchanged gifts with anyone for years, that Christmas had become just a date on the calendar, without any real celebration. "I didn't have anyone to give presents to," he finally said, trying to keep his voice neutral. Julia frowned thoughtfully. "But presents aren't just for people you know," she said with the simple logic of childhood. "Presents are for making people happy. You could have given a present to me, for example, or to my mum." The observation caught Robert off guard. He hadn't thought of that. For all those years he had closed himself off so much that the idea of giving something to someone simply no longer occurred to him. "You're right," he admitted. "That was thoughtless of me." Julia shrugged, already losing interest in the topic. "It's okay. You can give one next year. I like books and colorful things." Robert smiled. It was impossible not to smile at that spontaneity. "I'll remember that." Maria appeared at the living room doorway, carrying a bucket and cleaning cloths. "Julia, leave Mr. Anderson alone and come help me here," she called, but Robert raised his hand. "She's not bothering me," he said. "In fact, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk with her for a bit." Maria seemed surprised, but agreed with a nod. Julia stood beside Robert, watching him with the intense curiosity children have when they sense an adult is about to say something important. "You were talking about making people happy," Robert began, sitting on the sofa and motioning for Julia to sit beside him. "Do you think it's important to make people happy?" Julia nodded with conviction. "Very important. Because when people are sad, the world is grey, but when they're happy, the world is colourful." Robert felt a tightness in his chest. That simple description perfectly captured how he had lived for the past 7 years. A grey world, colourless, lifeless. "And you never get sad?" he asked. The girl thought for a moment. "I do. When I was 5, my dad left. My mum was really sad, and I was too. But then she told me we could choose to stay sad forever or try to be happy again, and we chose to try to be happy." Robert fell silent, processing her words. There was a wisdom in that simplicity that struck him deeply. "And did you succeed?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Did you manage to be happy again?" Julia smiled. "We're trying. Sometimes it's hard, but my mum says the important thing is to try, because if we don't try, we'll never succeed." Robert looked at the child and saw something he had forgotten existed. Hope. Not the naive hope that everything would magically be okay, but the hope that it was possible to choose to try, even when everything seemed impossible. "You're very wise for someone so little," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Julia shrugged as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It's because I pay attention to things. My mum says paying attention is important. That's how I noticed you're sad. Robert swallowed hard. You noticed that? Julia nodded. It's easy to see. Your eyes are always looking far away, like you're searching for something that isn't here. And you never really smile. You only smile with your mouth, not with your eyes. The observation was so accurate that Robert didn't know what to say. This 7-year-old girl had captured something that perhaps even he wasn't fully aware of. You're right, he finally admitted. I lost someone very important a few years ago. And since then, I've had a hard time being happy again. Julia tilted her head, thoughtful. Who did you lose? Robert hesitated. It had been years since he had spoken about this with anyone, but there was something about Julia's presence that made it easier, less painful. My wife, he said, his voice low. She passed away when she was expecting our baby. Julia was quiet for a moment, processing the information. Then she must be in the stars now, she said matter-of-factly. My grandma is in the stars too. My mom says the people we love never really go away, because they stay right here. She pointed to her own chest. In our hearts. Robert felt his eyes sting. There was something profoundly moving in that childish explanation, something that touched a wound he had kept closed for so long. Do you really think so? He asked. Julia nodded firmly. I do, because I remember my grandma every day, the stories she told, the way she made chocolate cake. And when I remember, it's like she's with me again, even if I can't see her. Robert remained silent, letting those words sink in. For the first time in years, he allowed memories of Caroline to surface without immediately blocking them. He remembered her smile, the way she sang while making breakfast, the plans they made for the future. And for the first time, those memories didn't just bring pain, they also brought a strange warmth, as if they were a gift he had forgotten to open. You're a very special girl, Julia, Robert said, his voice choked with emotion. Thank you for talking with me. Julia smiled, and without warning gave him a tight hug. Robert tensed for a moment, unaccustomed to physical contact for so long, but then he relaxed and returned the hug, feeling a strange emotion rise in his throat. When Maria finished her work that afternoon, Robert called her over before she left. He offered for her to come, back over the next few days, inventing more tasks that needed to be done. Maria accepted without question, though there was something in her eyes that suggested she understood this wasn't just about cleaning. Over the following week, Julia became a constant presence in the mansion. She explored every room with curiosity, asking questions about the paintings on the walls, the books on the shelves, the old objects Robert had forgotten even existed. And with every question, every observation, she drew out memories that were buried, stories he had kept locked away for fear they would hurt too much. It was on one of those afternoons, while playing in a second-floor hallway, that Julia found a locked door. She tried to open it, but the knob wouldn't turn. What's in this room? She asked when Robert appeared in the hallway. He turned pale. That door had been closed for 7 years, and he had thrown the key in a drawer trying to forget the room existed. It's just an empty room, he lied, but his voice was too tense to be convincing. Julia looked at him with the intensity children have when they know an adult is hiding something. If it's locked, it can't be empty. Empty things don't need to be locked. Robert didn't know what to say. Maria, who had come up the stairs at that moment, sensed the tension and called her daughter. Julia, leave Mr. Anderson alone. Come help me fold these towels. The girl obeyed, but before she walked away, she glanced once more at the locked door and then at Robert. Will you show me what's inside someday? She asked. Robert swallowed hard. Someday, he replied, not sure if someday would ever come. But that question echoed in his mind for the rest of the day. At night, alone again, he went upstairs and stood before that door. He placed his hand on the cold doorknob and felt the weight of all those years pressing on his chest. He couldn't open it. Not yet. But for the first time, he considered the possibility that maybe one day he would have the courage to face what was on the other side. The next morning, Maria arrived early, but this time without Julia. The girl had caught a mild flu, she explained, and was at home with a neighbor. Robert felt a pang of disappointment that surprised him. He had grown accustomed to her presence, her questions, her energy that filled the house in a way he hadn't experienced in years. "How is she?" he asked, genuinely concerned. "Oh, nothing serious," Maria replied with a smile. "Just a kid's flu, you know how it is. Low fever, runny nose. She was upset she couldn't come, said she wanted to keep exploring the house." Robert smiled. "Tell her the house will be here when she's better, and so will I." Maria looked at him with an expression that was hard to decipher, something between gratitude and caution. "You've been very kind to Julia," she said. "She talks about you all the time at home, says you're the sad friend who's learning to be happy again." The description took Robert by surprise. Was that what he was doing? Learning to be happy again? He wasn't sure, but he couldn't deny that something inside him was changing. The house no longer felt so empty. The silence didn't weigh so heavily. And for the first time in 7 years, he wasn't just surviving. He was starting to live. "She's a special girl," Robert said. "She has a way of seeing. The world that makes you want to see it too." Maria smiled, and there was pride in that smile. She's always been like that, ever since she was little. Even when her father left and everything got hard, she kept looking on the bright side. Sometimes I think she's stronger than I am. Robert felt a strange connection in that moment, as if he and Maria shared something in common. They had both lost, they had both suffered, and they were both trying somehow to move forward. "Strength comes from unexpected places," he said, "sometimes from a 7-year-old girl who isn't afraid to ask tough questions." Maria laughed, a light sound that filled the hallway. "That's true, she has no filter. I hope she hasn't been too much of a bother." "Not at all," Robert said, and it was the absolute truth. "In fact, she's helped me more than you can imagine." The following days passed in a strange but comforting routine. Maria continued to come to work, and even without Julia around, Robert found himself talking with her about things that weren't just about the house or the job. He asked about her life, about the challenges of raising a daughter alone, about the dreams she had. And Maria, little by little, began to open up too, talking about her struggles, but also about her joys, about how every small achievement of Julia's was a victory worth all the effort. Something was building there, something Robert couldn't name. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something more subtle, more delicate. It was connection. It was the realization that maybe he didn't have to be alone, that maybe there were people willing to enter his life, if only he would let them. When Julia finally returned a week later, bringing all her usual energy with her, Robert felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, genuine joy. The girl burst into the house like a hurricane, telling him about the cartoons she had watched, the dreams she'd had, all the things she wanted to show him. And that afternoon, as Julia drew on the living room floor and Maria worked in the upstairs bedrooms, Robert looked around and realized the house was no longer silent. It was alive, and for the first time in 7 years, he didn't want it to end. January brought with it the typical New York summer heat, the kind of humid warmth that made the air feel heavy and the afternoons drag on slowly. The city was gradually returning to its routine, people coming back from vacation, the traffic reclaiming its usual chaos. But inside Robert's mansion, something had changed irreversibly. The house was no longer the silent mausoleum it had been for so long. Now there were voices, laughter, movement. Robert had come up with increasingly elaborate excuses for Maria to keep coming. The closets needed reorganizing, the curtains needed cleaning, the basement needed tidying. She accepted the jobs without question, though there was a silent understanding in her eyes that this was about much more than cleaning. And Julia, always present, continued to occupy the spaces of the house as if it were her own, turning every room into a territory for exploration and discovery. It was on one of those hot January afternoons, while Maria was in the yard cleaning the exterior windows and Robert was working in his office, that Julia decided to play hide-and-seek by herself. She ran through the second-floor hallways, looking for the perfect hiding spot. When she passed the locked door again, This time, however, something was different. The door was ajar. Robert had gone up that morning, moved by an impulse he didn't fully understand, and unlocked it. He hadn't gone in. He didn't have the courage for that, but he left the door just slightly ajar, as if taking a first step towards something that terrified him. Julia, with the natural curiosity of a child, pushed the door open slowly. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, blocking the sunlight. She entered carefully, as if she instinctively knew she was treading on sacred ground. Gradually her eyes adjusted to the dimness, and she began to make out the shapes of what was inside. A wooden crib in the corner, a nursing chair covered with a white sheet, shelves with still-wrapped children's books, stuffed animals lined up like silent soldiers. Julia walked through the room with reverence, lightly touching each object. She didn't fully understand what it all meant, but she knew it was important, that there was a sad story behind the door that had been locked for so long. That's when she saw it, on a small dresser next to the window, a wooden box decorated with delicate carvings. The girl approached and carefully opened the box. Inside she found dozens of envelopes, some yellowed with age, others still white. She picked one up and saw it was addressed to Caroline, but it had never been sent. There was a stamp, but no postmark. Julia couldn't read all the words, but she recognized a few. "Miss you, love, always sorry." At that moment, Robert came up the stairs looking for Julia. When he saw the bedroom door open, his heart pounded. He entered quickly and found the girl holding the box, her wide eyes staring at the envelopes. "Julia," he said, his voice louder than he intended. "What are you doing in here?" The girl was startled but didn't let go of the box. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "The door was open and I came in. I found a memory box with letters inside." Robert froze. A memory box. The description was so precise, so painful, that he didn't know how to respond. He approached slowly and knelt beside Julia, looking at the box he hadn't opened in years. "These are letters I wrote," he explained, his voice trembling. "To someone I loved very much." Julia looked at him with the seriousness children have when they realize something is profoundly important. "To the lady who's in the stars?" she asked. Robert nodded, unable to speak. Julia held the box out to him. "You should read them. When we keep things only inside our hearts, they get too heavy. My mum says sometimes we need to let them out so we can breathe better." Robert took the box with trembling hands. He hadn't touched those letters in years, written during sleepless nights when the pain was so great that the only way to bear it was to put it on paper. He never sent them, because there was nowhere to send them. Caroline was gone, and those words were trapped in time, silent witnesses to a grief that seemed endless. Julia lightly touched his arm. "Do you want me to stay here with you?" she asked. "Sometimes it's easier when someone is with you." Robert looked at the child and felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost knocked him over. "Yes," he whispered. "I'd like that." They sat on the floor of the room, Robert leaning against the wall and Julia beside him. He opened the first envelope with trembling fingers and began to read in a low voice. They were words of love, of longing, of apologies for not being able to save her, of promises he hadn't known how to keep. Each sentence was like a wound being reopened, but this time something was different. It wasn't just pain. It was also release. Julia listened in silence, holding his hand. Sometimes she didn't understand all the words, but she understood the feeling. And when Robert paused, his voice too choked to continue, she just squeezed his hand, reminding him that he wasn't alone. There were more than 20 letters, some long, some short, some filled with anger, others with acceptance. Each one was a piece of Robert's journey through grief, a map of a pain he had carried alone for so long, and by reading them aloud, for the first time, he felt as if he were finally allowing that pain to leave him, to stop being just his and become something shared, something that could be witnessed and perhaps endured. When he finished the last letter, Robert was silent for a long time. Julia got up and hugged him, a tight, sincere hug. "She was very lucky to have you," the girl whispered, And she still does because you remember her every day." Robert hugged Julia back, feeling the tears finally flow uncontrollably. They were tears of pain, but also of relief. For the first time in 7 years, he was truly crying, not the restrained, silent weeping he occasionally allowed himself in the solitude of the night, but a deep, liberating cry that came from a place he had kept locked for too long. Maria found them like that, embracing on the floor of the room that held so many memories. She stood at the door for a moment, unsure whether to enter or discreetly walk away. It was Robert who saw her first. He wiped his eyes and gestured for her to come closer. "I'm sorry," Maria said, hesitant. "Julia shouldn't have come in here. I wasn't watching her properly." Robert shook his head. "No," he said, his voice still hoarse. "It's okay. In fact, it might have been exactly what I needed." In the following days, something fundamentally changed in Robert. He began to talk about Caroline openly, no longer avoiding the subject as if it were poison. He told Julia stories about her, about how they met, the plans they had, the dreams they shared. And each story, instead of increasing the pain, seemed to ease it a little. The memories were no longer just a source of suffering. They were also a treasury of good times, of a love that had been real and true. Julia listened attentively, asking questions when something wasn't clear, offering simple yet profound observations that always seemed to get to the heart of the matter. And Maria, watching this transformation from a distance, began to realize that what was happening there was something delicate and precious. A man was coming back to life. It was on one of those days when Robert was particularly cheerful, after spending the whole afternoon talking with Julia about everything and nothing, that the girl made a request. "You know what would make this house even happier?" she asked, looking around the living room. "A dog." Robert blinked, surprised. "A dog?" Julia nodded enthusiastically. "Dogs make everything more cheerful. They run, they play, they lick your face, and they're never sad alone because they're always happy when you come home. I've always wanted a dog, but our apartment is too small." The idea stuck in Robert's head. He had never considered getting a pet. Especially after Caroline was gone, it seemed like another responsibility, another thing to worry about. But now, looking at Julia and seeing the expectation in her eyes, he started to think differently. Maybe a dog was exactly what this house needed. Maybe it was exactly what he needed. 2 days later, Robert came home with a surprise. He had gone to an animal shelter that morning and chosen a golden retriever puppy, all golden and clumsy, with expressive eyes and contagious energy. When Julia saw the dog, she shrieked with joy so loudly it echoed through the house. "Is he ours?" she asked, incredulous, scooping the puppy into her arms and immediately getting licked on the face. "He belongs to the house," Robert corrected with a smile, "but you can help take care of him whenever you're here." Julia hugged the dog so tightly that the poor animal yelped slightly. Maria watched, her eyes welling up. "Mr. Anderson, you didn't have to," she said, her voice choked. "This is too much." Robert shook his head. "It's not too much, it's fair. You two have given me much more than a dog could ever repay. This is just a small way of giving back." The puppy quickly became part of the household routine. Julia named him Sunny because he was golden like the sunbeams that streamed through the living room window. And Sunny brought an energy that completely transformed the mansion's atmosphere. There were barks echoing through the hallways, muddy paw prints on the marble floors, toys scattered across the living room. It was a chaotic and wonderful mess, the complete opposite of the orderly silence that had dominated the house for so long. Robert discovered that caring for Sunny required constant attention. The dog needed to be fed, walked, trained, taken to the vet. These were responsibilities that pulled him out of his isolated routine, forcing him to leave the house, interact with people, and participate in life. And he realized with surprise that he was enjoying it. Julia came over every day to play with Sunny. She taught the dog tricks, ran with him in the yard, and read stories aloud while the puppy slept in her lap. And Robert watched it all with a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time: contentment. Maria also began to spend more time at the house, not just working, but staying for late afternoon conversations, impromptu coffees in the kitchen, and simple dinners that turned into moments of genuine connection. A naturalness was growing between them, an ease that didn't need to be forced. They talked about everything: childhood, dreams, fears, hopes. One evening, after Julia had gone home and Maria was about to leave, Robert called out to her. He was in the living room, Sonny asleep at his feet, and there was something he needed to say. "I wanted to thank you," he began, choosing his words carefully, "for everything you and Julia have done for me. You helped me remember that it's possible to live again even after losing everything." Maria stood at the door, touched by the sincerity of his words. "You didn't lose everything," she said gently. "You're still here, and that means there's still so much ahead." Robert looked at her, really looked, and for the first time allowed something beyond gratitude to surface. There was a connection there, something that went beyond the relationship between employer and employee, something that was growing silently, unhurriedly but steadily. He didn't know exactly what it was or where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time he wasn't afraid to find out. Maria held his gaze for a moment, and there was something in her eyes that suggested she felt that connection too. But then she looked away, murmured a quick goodbye, and left, leaving Robert alone with his thoughts. Sonny woke up and climbed onto the sofa, resting his head on Robert's lap. He stroked the dog's soft fur and smiled. The house was no longer silent. His heart was no longer frozen. And for the first time in 7 years, Robert allowed hope to enter, even knowing that hope always came with fear. Because to truly live meant risking getting hurt again, but it also meant the possibility of being happy. And after so long in the darkness, Robert was finally willing to try to find the light. February brought even hotter days and a sense that time was moving too quickly. The routine that had been established in Robert's mansion felt solid, comfortable, almost as if it had always been this way. Julia came daily. Sonny chased imaginary things in the yard, and Maria moved through the house with a familiarity that went far beyond her initial role. There was laughter, conversation, moments of comfortable silence. Robert felt he was finally building something new on the ruins of what he had lost. But life has a cruel way of reminding us that nothing is permanent, that happiness can be fragile, and that the fear of loss never completely disappears. It just hides, waiting for the right moment to resurface. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, while Julia was playing with Sonny in the yard, that she started to feel unwell. At first, it was just an unusual tiredness, a lack of energy. That wasn't typical for a child who was usually pure motion. She sat on the grass, leaned her back against a tree, and called for her mother in a voice weaker than usual. Maria was finishing up in the kitchen when she heard the call. She ran outside and found Julia with a flushed face, her breathing slightly labored. She placed a hand on her daughter's forehead and felt the immediate heat, a high fever. Robert, who was in his office reviewing contracts, came downstairs upon hearing the hurried footsteps. He found Maria carrying Julia in her arms, worry etched on her face. The girl's eyes were half closed and she was moaning softly. "She has a very high fever," Maria said, her voice tense. "I need to take her to the hospital. I'm sorry, I have to leave now." Robert didn't hesitate. "I'll drive you," he said, already grabbing his car keys. "Come on, quickly." The drive to the nearest hospital was tense and silent. Maria held Julia in the back seat, whispering words of comfort as her daughter shivered. Robert drove with focus, but his hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. There was something about the situation that was affecting him in a way he hadn't expected, a rising panic that tightened his chest and throat. When they arrived at the emergency room, Julia was seen quickly. The doctors took her to an observation room, ran tests, took her temperature, which was 103 degrees, and ordered blood work. Maria stayed by her side, answering questions, signing consent forms, trying to remain calm even as her hands trembled. Robert sat in the waiting room on an uncomfortable plastic chair. His hands clasped, his leg bouncing nervously. Around him other people waited for news, some crying, others praying, all bearing the weight of worry that hospitals inevitably bring. But Robert barely noticed. His mind was stuck in a loop, remembering another waiting room, another hospital, Another time he had waited for news that never came in time. He stood up abruptly, walked to the window and tried to take a deep breath. But the air wouldn't seem to enter his lungs. His hands were shaking. He was scared. Not because of Julia's clinical condition, which the doctors had already indicated was likely just a common viral infection in children. He was scared because he had realized something fundamental and terrifying. He cared. Deeply. Desperately. He had allowed himself to form a bond, and now he was experiencing the terror of potentially losing it. 2 hours later, Maria came out of the observation room. Julia was better. The fever had come down with medication, and the test showed nothing serious. She would be discharged soon, needing only to continue treatment at home with medicine and rest. Everything was going to be okay. Robert felt his legs weaken with relief. He braced his hands on his knees and took a deep breath, trying to control the wave of emotion that hit him. Maria approached and touched his shoulder lightly. "It's okay," she said softly. "It was just a scare." Robert looked at her, and there were tears in his eyes he couldn't control. "I thought that," he began, but couldn't finish the sentence. Maria understood. She squeezed his shoulder more firmly, a gesture of silent comfort. When Julia finally came out, she was pale, but smiling. She saw Robert and held out her arms to him. Robert hugged her carefully, as if she were made of glass. "You gave me a scare," he said, his voice choked. "Sorry," Julia murmured, nuzzling her head into his shoulder. "But I'm better now. Can I play with Sonny tomorrow?" Robert laughed, a sound that was half broken, half relieved. "Let's see what the doctor says, okay?" The ride home was lighter, but Robert remained quiet, processing what he had just experienced. That visceral fear, that panic of losing someone he loved. Because that was it, he finally admitted to himself. He loved that child. And he was probably starting to love her mother too. And that terrified him. In the following days, as Julia recovered at home, Robert kept his distance. He called to ask how she was, sent texts offering help, but didn't visit in person. Maria noticed the change but didn't comment, respecting the space he clearly needed. It was on one of those mornings, as Robert was in the yard watching Sonny chase butterflies, that a silver Mercedes pulled up in front of the mansion. Patricia, his sister, got out of the car with her usual elegance, a designer bag on her arm, sunglasses shielding her eyes from the bright sun. Robert wasn't expecting the visit. Patricia lived in a penthouse on the Upper East Side and rarely showed up unannounced. They got along well but maintained a respectful distance, each living their own life without much interference. "Surprise," Patricia said, taking off her sunglasses and kissing her brother's cheek. "I was in the neighborhood and decided to stop by. It's been a while." Robert greeted her with a somewhat awkward hug and invited her inside. Patricia surveyed the house with a critical, experienced eye, immediately noticing the changes. There were dog toys scattered in the living room, children's drawings taped to the refrigerator, a cozy mess that was completely different from the sterile order that used to dominate the space. "Do you have company?" she asked, taking a drawing from the fridge. It depicted a house with 3 people and a dog, drawn with vibrant crayons. Robert hesitated. "It's complicated," he began, but before he could explain, Sonny came running in, barking happily at the visitor. Patricia took a step back, clearly not expecting a dog. "Since when do you have a dog?" she asked, surprised. "A few weeks," Robert replied, picking Sonny up to calm him. "It's a long story." Patricia sat on the sofa, crossed her legs, and looked at her brother with an expression he knew well, the one that said she wasn't leaving without answers. "Then tell me this long story," Robert told her, about Maria, about Julia, about how the child had entered his life and helped him emerge from his grief. He talked about their conversations, the letters he read aloud, the dog, how the house had come back to life. As he spoke, his voice carried a genuine emotion, an enthusiasm Patricia hadn't seen in years. But when he finished, the ensuing silence was heavy. Patricia looked at him with an expression Robert couldn't decipher, something between concern and disapproval. "Robert," she began, choosing her words carefully. "You realize what's happening here, don't you?" Robert frowned. "What are you talking about?" Patricia sighed. You're getting attached to an employee and her daughter, a woman who works for you, who has access to your house, your life, your money. Don't you find that at least a little problematic?" Robert felt a surge of irritation. "It's not like that, Patricia. It's not about money or social status. It's about human connection, about starting to live again." Patricia shook her head. "I know you're lonely. I know Caroline's death was devastating, but that doesn't mean you should latch on to the first person who shows up with a nice smile and a cute kid. Have you ever considered that maybe she's taking advantage of your vulnerability?" The words hit Robert like a punch. "Maria isn't like that," he said, but a small, poisonous seed of doubt was planted. Patricia stood up and placed a hand on her brother's shoulder. "I love you, and that's why I'm saying this. You're trying to replace the family you lost with a facsimile of affection. This girl isn't your daughter. This woman isn't Caroline. And the more you get attached to them, the more it will hurt when this illusion shatters." Robert was silent, his sister's words echoing in his mind. Patricia continued, now in a softer tone. "I know your intentions are good, but you need to protect yourself. You've suffered enough already. Don't put yourself in a position where you can get hurt again." After Patricia left, Robert was alone in the empty house, Sonny lying at his feet. His sister's words had planted a seed of doubt that was growing rapidly. What if she was right? What if he was just trying to fill a void with people who couldn't truly fill it? What if he was being naive, letting someone take advantage of his loneliness? He looked at the drawings on the fridge, the scattered toys, all the life that had entered his home. And for the first time in weeks, instead of joy, he felt fear. Fear that he was deceiving himself, fear that he was betraying Caroline's memory, fear of getting hurt again. That night, Robert made a decision. It was a decision driven by panic, by doubt, by the fear of being manipulated. It was a decision he would deeply regret, but at that moment it seemed like the only way to protect himself. The next morning, when Maria arrived for work, Robert was waiting for her in the living room. He had rehearsed what he would say, but the words still came out harsh, cold, different from everything he truly felt. "Maria," he began, avoiding her eyes, "I don't think I'll be needing your services anymore. I appreciate everything, but I think it's best we end things here." Maria froze. "What?" she asked, her voice low, incredulous. Robert forced a neutral expression. "I just think it's for the best. I'll deposit your payment for the services rendered and an extra severance, but I'd prefer it if you didn't come back." Maria looked at him for a long moment, trying to understand what was happening. There was hurt in her eyes, but also pride. "If that's what you want, Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice controlled but trembling, "I'll respect your decision." She turned to leave but paused at the door. "I just wanted you to know that Julia is going to be very sad. She got attached to you, and to Sonny, but I'll explain to her that sometimes things just aren't meant to be. Take care, Mr. Anderson." And then she was gone, closing the door behind her with a softness that somehow hurt more than a slam. Robert stood in the empty living room, Sonny at his side, staring at the door where Maria had left. The dog began to whine, sensing the absence even without understanding. Robert sat on the floor and held Sonny against his chest, trying to control the pain rising in his throat. He had done it to protect himself, to avoid getting hurt, to not betray Caroline's memory. But as he sat there in the absolute silence that was once again dominating the house, Robert realized a devastating truth. In trying to avoid future pain, he had created a present pain that was almost unbearable. And for the first time since Caroline had passed, he didn't know how to fix what he had broken. The days that followed were the longest Robert had experienced since the first few months after Caroline's passing. The house returned to absolute silence, but this time it was different. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absence of life, of possibility, of a future. The lights of the Christmas tree, which he still hadn't taken down, blinked alone in the empty living room, like silent witnesses to something that had been destroyed. Sonny missed Julia viscerally. The dog would stand by the front door for hours, waiting for her to appear. He refused food, barked at the empty doorway, and slept less. Robert tried to comfort him, but how do you comfort someone when you're shattered yourself? Robert returned to his old routine, but now it was worse because he knew what he was missing. He knew what it was like to wake up with the expectation of hearing a child's laughter echoing through the halls. He knew what it was like to have someone to talk to over breakfast. He knew what it was like to feel that his house was a home and not just a structure of bricks and mortar. Patricia called a few times, asking if he was okay. Robert lied, said yes, that he had done the right thing, but at night, when the silence became unbearable, he would go up to what would have been the baby's room and look at the empty space where the box of letters used to be. He had taken the letters to his office, rereading each one obsessively, searching in every word for some guidance, some sign of what to do. It was on one of those nights, a week after he had sent Maria away, that Robert entered the room again. The full moon shone through the window, illuminating the empty crib, the covered chair, the silent stuffed animals. He sat on the floor, leaned his back against the wall, and let the tears fall uncontrollably. He had spent 7 years believing that honoring Caroline's memory meant staying trapped in the past, that loving again would be a betrayal, that being happy would be disrespectful to what they had shared. But now, in that silent room, Robert finally understood something fundamental. Caroline would have never wanted this for him. She would have never wished for him to spend his entire life alone, frozen in time, refusing all forms of connection and love. That's when he saw it. Taped to the wall next to the window, half hidden behind the curtain, was a drawing he hadn't noticed before. Robert stood up and took it down carefully. It was Julia's drawing, made with colourful crayons, 3 people holding hands, under a big bright star, with the word family scrawled in crooked letters underneath. He held the paper as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Julia had left it there, probably during one of her explorations of the house, a small hidden gift to be found at the right moment. And the message was clear. Family wasn't just blood, it wasn't just biology. Family was a choice. It was love. It was presence. Robert ran down the stairs, Sunny waking with a start and chasing after him. He grabbed his phone and dialed Maria's number, but she didn't answer. He tried 2 more times, each call going to voicemail. He looked at the clock. It was past 11 at night. Too late to call, but not too late to act. He grabbed his car keys, put Sunny in the passenger seat, and drove out into the rainy New York night. A heavy downpour had started, the kind of summer storm that turns streets into rivers and brings traffic to a standstill. But Robert drove with determination, remembering the address Maria had once mentioned, an apartment in a housing complex in Queens. The rain pounded against the windshield, the wipers barely able to keep up. Robert drove for nearly an hour, crossing the sleeping city, until he finally reached the address. It was a simple 5-story building, its facade weathered by time, but with lights still on in a few windows. He parked the car, grabbed Sunny, and ran through the rain to the building's entrance. There was no doorman, just an intercom with several numbered buttons. Robert found Maria's apartment number and pressed insistently until a sleepy voice finally answered. "Hello?" "Maria, it's me, Robert. Please, I need to talk to you." There was a long silence on the other end. Robert held Sunny tighter, the wet dog shivering against his chest. After what felt like an eternity, the door buzzed open. Robert climbed 3 flights of stairs, Sunny in his arms, dripping water all the way. When he reached the apartment, the door was already ajar. Maria stood there wearing a simple robe, her hair down, her eyes red as if she had been crying. Behind her, Julia appeared, still in her pajamas, her eyes wide with surprise. "Sunny!" the girl cried, running to hug the wet dog. Robert set him down, and Sunny licked Julia's face enthusiastically, barking with joy at finally being reunited with his friend. Maria looked at Robert, waiting for him to speak. There was hurt in her eyes, but also a cautious openness, a willingness to listen. "I made a mistake," Robert began, his voice broken by emotion and the rain streaming down his face. "A terrible mistake. I let fear control me. I let doubt destroy something that was real and precious." Maria crossed her arms, trying to maintain an emotional distance. "Why are you here, Robert? Why now?" Robert swallowed hard. "Because I finally understand. My sister said, I was trying to replace the past, but she was wrong. I'm not trying to replace anything. I'm trying to move on. I'm trying to live again. And I realized I can't do it alone. I don't want to do it alone. He looked at Julia, who was watching everything while holding Sunny. And you, he said, pointing to the girl. You taught me that it's possible to keep the people we love in our hearts and still have room to love again. That remembering doesn't mean standing still. That honoring the past doesn't mean giving up on the future. Tears began to stream down Maria's face. Robert took a step forward, but still kept a respectful distance. I pushed you away because I was afraid of getting hurt again. Because I thought if I let myself love you both, I would be betraying Caroline's memory. But I was wrong, because Caroline loved me, and people who love you want you to be happy, not trapped in a tomb of memories. He pulled the drawing Julia had left in the room from his pocket. I found this today, and I realized that you, he looked at Julia, are more right than any adult. Family isn't just blood, it's a choice, it's presence, it's love. Maria wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Robert, I can't be Caroline for you, and Julia can't be the daughter you lost. We are who we are, with all our imperfections, our limitations. Robert shook his head firmly. I don't want you to be Caroline. I want you to be Maria. And I don't want Julia to be a replacement. I want her to be exactly who she is. An incredible girl who taught me how to live again. You two saved me, without even realizing it. And I was an idiot to let fear destroy that. Julia let go of Sunny and ran to hug Robert. I knew you'd come back, she said, her voice muffled against his chest. I told Mom you'd come back. Robert hugged the girl tightly, feeling the tears flow freely now. I'm sorry, Julia. I'm sorry for being such a coward. Maria watched the scene, fighting her own emotions. Finally, she took a few steps forward. We're from different worlds, Robert. You're wealthy, and I'm a woman who cleans houses to get by. People will judge. Your sister will judge. The whole world will have an opinion about this. Robert let go of Julia and stood in front of Maria. Let them judge, he said firmly. I spent 7 years caring about what doesn't matter. I spent 7 years living a half-life. You taught me, without even realizing it, that the only thing that truly matters is what we feel. And I feel that I want to try. I want to try to build something new with you. I want to try to be happy again. If you give me a chance, I promise I'll make it worthwhile. Maria looked at him for a long moment. There was doubt in her eyes, but also hope. Finally, she gave a small smile. You're dripping water all over my apartment. Robert looked down and saw the puddle that had formed around his feet. He laughed, a light, relieved sound. Sorry, I was in a hurry. Maria shook her head, but she was smiling. Get in here. I'll get you a towel. That night, they talked until dawn. Sitting on the small sofa in the simple apartment, with Julia asleep on a mattress on the floor, cuddled up with Sunny, Robert and Maria talked about everything, about fears, about hopes, about what could be. They didn't promise forever because they both knew life offers no guarantees, but they promised to try. They promised to be present. They promised to choose each other every day, even when it was hard. Christmas that year was completely different. For the first time in 8 years, Robert didn't set a table for one. He went to Maria's simple apartment, bringing Sunny and a bag full of presents. Julia opened each one with her usual contagious enthusiasm, and when she got to the last one, an illustrated storybook, she hugged Robert so tightly she nearly knocked him over. They ate roast chicken, mashed potatoes, stuffing, and green bean casserole, just as Julia had promised months before. The table was small, the food was simple, but it was filled with something that had been missing from Robert's life for so long: true love. For the toast, Robert didn't raise his glass to the emptiness. He raised it to Maria, to Julia, to Sunny sleeping under the table. To new beginnings, he said, his voice firm and emotional. To the family we choose. Maria held his hand across the table and squeezed it tightly. To the family we choose, she repeated. The following months brought significant changes. Maria left her cleaning job, and with financial support from Robert, structured as a loan she insisted on repaying, she started a small home organization business, maintaining her independence and dignity. She didn't want charity, she wanted an opportunity, and Robert respected that completely. Julia began to frequent the mansion not as a visitor, but as part of the family. She got her own room, which she decorated with her drawings and toys. Sonny finally had the constant companionship he had always wanted. The house was alive again, but now in a permanent, solid, real way. Patricia, initially resistant, eventually acknowledged the transformation in her brother. At a family lunch a few months later, she apologized to Maria, admitting she had projected her own fears and prejudices onto the situation. "I was wrong," she said sincerely. "You're good for each other, and Julia is a blessing in my brother's life." A year after that simple Christmas, on a sunny Sunday morning, Robert took Maria and Julia to a place he hadn't visited in a long time, the cemetery where Caroline rested. He held Maria's hand as they walked among the headstones, Julia a few steps behind holding a bouquet of white flowers. When they reached the grave, Robert knelt and placed his hand on the cold stone. "Caroline," he said in a low but firm voice, "I want you to meet someone. Actually, I want you to meet two very special people. This is Maria, and this is Julia. They helped me remember how to live again. They helped me understand that loving you doesn't mean standing still in time." Julia placed the flowers beside the headstone and looked at the engraved name. "She was important to you, wasn't she?" the girl asked softly. Robert nodded, tears streaming freely. "The most important. She taught me how to love, and because of that, I was able to love again." Maria knelt beside him and held his hand. "Thank you for loving him so well," she whispered to the headstone, "for making him the man he is. We'll take care of him now, I promise." They stayed there for a few more minutes in respectful silence before getting up and walking back to the car. Robert glanced back one last time and felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. It wasn't the end of his longing, nor was it forgetting. It was the acceptance that it's possible to carry the past in your heart and still walk toward the future. 2 years after that day at the hospital that changed everything, Robert and Maria were married in a small intimate ceremony with only close friends and family. Julia was the maid of honor, wearing a blue dress she had chosen herself, and Sonny was the ring bearer, with the rings tied to a ribbon around his neck. When the justice of the peace asked if Robert took Maria to be his wife, he answered with a firm, emotional voice, "I do with all my heart." And as he kissed his bride, with Julia clapping enthusiastically and Sonny barking with joy, Robert knew he had finally completed his journey. It wasn't a journey of forgetting or replacement. It was a journey of transformation, of understanding that the human heart has an infinite capacity to love, that it's possible to honor those who are gone and embrace those who are present, that remembering and living are not opposing actions but complementary ones. The mansion in Scarsdale was no longer an empty house. It was a home filled with laughter, messes, love, and life. The Christmas trees were now decorated every year by 3 pairs of hands, dinners were no longer solitary, and the silence had given way to conversations, music, and games. Robert still kept the letters he had written to Caroline, but now they were no longer witnesses to an endless grief. They were memories of a love that was real and important, but that didn't have to prevent new loves from blossoming. He had learned in the most painful and beautiful way possible that life goes on, and that moving on isn't a betrayal, it's courage. One ordinary evening, years later, Robert was sitting in the living room watching Julia, now a teenager, study for a math test, while Maria read a book beside him on the sofa and Sonny, now old and calmer, slept at his feet. He looked around at the ordinary and extraordinary scene and felt a profound gratitude. Because he had learned that happiness doesn't come from grand gestures or epic moments. It comes from the details. A child asking unfiltered questions, a dog licking your face, a woman holding your hand during a movie, a house that finally feels like a home. Robert had spent 7 years believing his story had ended, but in reality, it was just waiting to be rewritten. And this time, he wasn't writing it alone. He had company, he had love, he had family, and that he finally understood was all that truly mattered. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Robert, Maria, and Julia has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of overcoming, love, and new beginnings, Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what resonated with you the most. Was it Robert's courage to allow himself to love again, Julia's wisdom, Maria's strength? Every day, we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul, teaching us about loss and new beginnings, about the power of love and the importance of choosing happiness. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with another story that will stir your emotions.